Yeah. And then, so we discussed that. And then chapter 19 discusses the story of when the angels actually show up in the city of Sodom. But I just want to say one point before that, before we get to 19, we go back to 18 and we go back to the introduction of why Hashem would tell Abraham what he's about to do with Sodom. So in this stone, it's 81. In the stone, it's page 81. I'll share the screen in a moment. The bottom of page, really the top of 83, I guess. Yeah, I want to look at verse 19, chapter 18, verse 19. So if we share the screen, we go back to 18, verse 19, and the verse says as follows. God says, we'll read 17 first, and the Lord said, shall I conceal from Abraham what I am doing? And then verse 18 and 19 talks about sort of the justification, why God would not conceal from Abraham what he's about to do. So, and Abraham will become a great and powerful nation, and all the nations of the world will be blessed by him. Okay. For I have known him, because he commands his sons and his household after him, that they should keep the way of the Lord to perform righteousness and justice, in order that the Lord bring upon Abraham that which he spoke concerning him. So we discussed that verse in the past, but I just want to highlight one point, and that is as follows. Here they translate ki yada'ativ, or l'man asher yitzaveh. They translate this because he commands in the present. Yitzaveh is also, the yud is really future tense. The reason why it becomes present is because in Hebrew, something that is continuous, you use the future tense, and the future, if it's continuous, it's sort of the present and the future. So you can really translate like this in verse 19, for I have known him, ki yadativ, I know him. God says, I know Abraham, lema'an, because, or really, lema'an is really in order, asher yitzaveh, because he will command his household. So this is a very interesting reason, especially if you compare it to Noach. So if you go back to Noach for a second, why was Noach saved? Noach was saved because he was a righteous man. So one way to think about it is Noach was saved because of what he did. That's why Noach was chosen, because of the past. Noach was, if he did a certain amount of good deeds, he was considered righteous, he's going to be saved. Why is Abraham saved? Or why is Abraham unique? He's not being saved, he's not threatened in this case. But why is he unique? Not because we say, well, he is at this point, he's 99 years old and he has all these merits and it's wonderful. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying he's chosen because he's unique and chosen because of what he did in the past. It's future tense. God says, I know him, I have a relationship because of what he is going to do. What is he going to do? He is going to command his household after him to teach them justice. In other words, the uniqueness of Abraham, the reason why Abraham was chosen is because of what he's going to do. So the empowerment, you could, well, first of all, Noach, you don't really see it. You don't really see that Noach, after the flood, was able to perpetuate and teach his values. And in fact, the last final scene of Noach is a very negative one. He's drunk. He's not able to do anything positive. So what we're trying to say is, all I'm trying to say is about the broader question, because people think, people talked about the idea that the Torah says people are unique, the Jewish people are unique, chosen, and what does it really mean? And it makes certain people uncomfortable. But here you see with Abraham, chosen means not that you're getting an award, you're getting a plaque for what you have done. That would fit Noach's model, right? Noach says, Noach was a righteous man, therefore he's being saved. He's getting an award. This Abraham, it's not like he's getting an award. God says, I know him because of what he did. It's, I know him because of what he's going to do. In other words, the chosenness, quote unquote, doesn't use the word chosenness, but the uniqueness of Abraham in this case is the fact that he is going empowered to do in the future. And that's the definition of the Abraham's unique position. So that is just one point about the general idea. One more point that I want to say is the Torah could have said many things about Abraham. He's moral, it teaches about the oneness of God, or he himself is kind. But one thing it says, I know him because he commands his children and his household after him. And it's just striking because I'm not sure the Torah meant to do this. I don't know. But just as the reader, when you read later the story that we're going to read today in chapter 19, and the verse describes how Lot, Abraham's nephew, who's living amongst the wicked people of Sodom, and nevertheless Lot goes out of his way to invite the guests, the two guests, into his home, and he hosts them, and he tries to make the stay pleasant. So there is a very interesting commentary by Rabbi Shamshon Fol Hirsch, who basically says, he says that scene is a very sad scene. Let's see if we can find it. Let's look at this. When you read it, it looks like it's a little sad. And this is before the tragedy starts. This is when everything is going good. Lot is inviting the guests. Lot is inviting the guests. I'm turning to chapter 19 and turning to... Okay, we'll read a few verses. Let's start from the beginning of the chapter. Why not? We'll read a few verses, and then we'll get to the point. So in the stone, it's 85, chapter 19, verse 1. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. And Lot saw and arose toward them, and he prostrated himself on his face to the ground. And he said, Behold, now my lords, please turn to your servant's house and stay overnight and wash your feet. And you shall arise early and go on your way. And they said, no, but we will stay overnight in the street. If you look very carefully, you see the Torah is alluding to the fact that Lot does not want to draw attention to himself. Lot would not necessarily invite them to his house in the middle of the afternoon, because that would be dangerous. So he tells them, the Torah emphasizes that it's in the evening. It's in the evening, it's not so light, you can't see who's coming. So if Lot is walking with other people, it's not so obvious that they're strangers. And in the morning, he says, it's very interesting. He says, you shall arise early and go on your way. Wake up early and hit the road, right? He doesn't want them to be caught in his house because that's against the law. But in any case, he's certainly going out of his way. He's certainly inviting them at some risk to himself, as we will see. They say, no, we want to stay in the street. Why do they want to stay in the street is another story. Verse 3, and he urged them strongly, and they turned into him, and he came into his house, and he made them a feast. And he baked unleavened cakes, and they ate. Wonderful. He made them a feast, and he baked cakes, unleavened cakes, matzot. Seems like a beautiful dinner. But Rabbi Shamshon Fol Hirsch points out, he says it's actually a very sad scene. And the reason why this is so sad, it doesn't seem sad, but it's very sad if you contrast that and compare it to Abraham. When Abraham invites the guests, it's not something that he's doing alone. His whole family is involved. Sarah's involved, she's baking. He tells the lad, which the sages say is Yishmael, to go and get the calf, to slaughter the calf. And 3 calves, I think, right? The Torah says 1 calf. The sages say it was 3. But in any case, what happens is over there, it's the commotion. Everybody, the entire household is involved in the process of inviting guests. So you have guests. It's like you say in Yiddish, it's a simcha. It's a joy for the whole family. Everybody's involved. By contrast, when you come to Lot is alone. He's a lonely person. You'll see later that even many people of his family don't want to leave with him. In other words, he was not able to convey his values to his family. And therefore, yes, it's commendable that he's inviting guests, but he's doing it alone by himself. And that's just sad. But maybe in addition to being sad, maybe that also ties into what the Torah by Abraham emphasizes. The verse we just read in chapter 18, the Torah emphasizes that Abraham, what is the uniqueness of Abraham? Not so much that he performs kindness himself, but that he commands it to his household. That's the point that's the point. I'm sorry, Lot had a family. Yes, he stayed with his 2 daughters, but he has other daughters, and he has a wife and other daughters and other sons-in-law that are all living in Sodom, as we will see as the story unfolds. But the point here is that he is able to perform the kindness, but he can only do it alone. He cannot convey that sense of the sense of kindness to his family. And that was his shortcoming. So it's just a sad scene. But again, when the Torah, in the lead up to the story, in chapter 18, when the Torah wants to say what is unique about Abraham, here the Torah emphasizes, it's not just that he does kindness. It's that the kindness that he does, he commands it to his family. When you come to Abraham's house and a guest shows up, it's not only that Abraham is kind, but the entire family is involved in the kindness. And that's the contrast to Lot, perhaps. Okay, that is the introduction just to go back to 18. Now we have to put out a few more introductions before we read this sad story of Sodom, and then we figure out what this story is trying to tell us, because the end has a strange twist with Lot and his two daughters. That's another whole story with ramifications for later, the book of Leviticus, of Deuteronomy, but also ramifications later for King David, who's a descendant of Ruth, the Moabite convert, who's really a descendant of Lot's daughter, actually the union between Lot and his daughter. So this gets a little tricky and complicated, but I don't know if we'll get there today, but this is certainly important because it's the end of the story. It seems like the story is leading to that direction. But let's give a few introductions in the just to start. So one point here is how do you get to a society? What is the philosophy of Lot? And what is the philosophy of Sodom before Lot? How do you get to a point where they outlaw kindness, where they outlaw charity? And what's the philosophy behind it, right? What do they say? The road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? So it doesn't start. You don't start with people who get up and say we're creating a society where you can't do kindness. It starts with a philosophy, with an idea, with a value, and it becomes Sodom. And that's why when the Torah describes Abraham, the commentaries point out, certainly the Hasidic commentaries point out, when the Torah describes Abraham, it chooses words that will actually explain the mistake, allude to the mistake of Sodom and where the people of Sodom went wrong. So I said this in the past, not on Sundays, but I said in the past, so I'm going to try to be brief. So let's look at the history. The history is we have the story of the flood. What happens at the story of the flood? The earth becomes Malach haaretz Hamas. The earth becomes full of robbery. In other words, in simple English, the people of the generation of the flood, they don't respect other people's possessions. They don't respect private property. That's essentially what happens, and that leads to absolute corruption where there's no civilization. Because if there's no private property, if I can just walk in and take your belongings, there's no civilization. And that's what the Torah says. The earth is filled with corruption. The only way we get to the point where it has to be destroyed and you have to start again. So if you survive the flood and you're learning history and you say, okay, what do we have to protect ourselves against? We have to protect ourselves against a society where the society does not respect private property, because that was the downfall of the people of Sodom. So what are we going to do? We're going to actually respect private property to the extreme. And we believe in private property as a philosophy, as a moral philosophy, because we saw what happens when people did not respect private property. And then they get to the point where they say, if that's the philosophy that we believe in, then having a culture or a society where you encourage people to give to other people, they say that's a slippery slope. You're going to get to the point where if what's mine, I have to give you what is mine, then maybe you'll come and take what's yours. You'll take from me. In other words, they want to have very strong boundaries to private property to protect against descending into the reality of the generation of the flood. And that's why you start with, we have a strong belief in private property. It's mine. If I own it, it's because God wants me to own it, or whatever terms they used, and it's mine, and I have no business giving it to somebody else. And they were threatened by people trying to give to other people, because that means you're undermining their philosophy of private property, which they thought would lead to the immorality of the people of the flood. So that's the philosophy. Where does the philosophy go wrong? First of all, are they right? Are they wrong? Go ahead.
Who made this?
So a few people say this, but let's go back and let's see where the Torah alludes to it. The Torah doesn't allude to it clearly, but the Torah alludes to it when the Torah describes Abraham. Abraham, in this story, chapter 18 and chapter 19, you have the Torah is putting two pictures: the picture of Abraham's tent, Abraham inviting guests, versus the people of Sodom. So we'll keep contrasting. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at that same verse that we looked at earlier in chapter 18, verse 19, and we're going to see how the Torah describes Abraham. And the commentaries explain, the Torah, if you look at the words, you'll see how the Torah is addressing Abraham in terms that explain the mistake of the people of Sodom. So that's where it's alluded to. So let's look at this verse, a fascinating verse. Verse 18, with verse 19, we read it already. Verse 19, in the stone, it's on page 83. Okay, for I have known him, because he commands his sons and his household after him that they should keep the way of the Lord to perform righteousness and justice. In Hebrew, tzedakah umishpat. Now we all know what tzedakah means. Tzedakah they translated as righteousness, but tzedakah is also translated as charity. Okay, so Abraham does charity and justice. Okay, so let's think about this phrase, charity and justice. Charity and justice raises all kinds of questions. The first question charity and justice raises is, first of all, charity and justice. The Torah says charity and justice, tzedakah umishpat, charity and justice, with a vav that connects the two. They're not the same thing. They're actually very different, right? They're very different. Justice represents I get what I deserve. That's justice. Charity means I get what I don't deserve. So what is charity and justice? How do these two ideas go together? So there are all kinds of interpretations, but the one we're going to stick with is as follows. You need a balance between charity and justice. So what does mishpat mean? Mishpat, they translate it as mishpat. Mishpat is law. There's law and there's charity. And you need to have both. What does this mean? What does law mean? Law means private property. That's the foundation of law. It's the foundation of all civil law. What happens if you take my stuff, I take your stuff? But law is premised on the concept that I have private property. It belongs to me. What is mine is mine. What is yours is yours. That's the foundation. That's mishpat. That's law. That's private property. But what Abraham understands is that private property is not a means to an end. Private property is so that we should have the opportunity to do kindness, to do tzedakah, to do charity. In other words, if there was no such thing as private property, like some philosophies try to create, socialism tries to create, there's no such thing as private property, then there's really no charity, there's no tzedakah. Because if it never belonged to me, then I give it to you. It's not my kindness, it's not mine to begin with. What Abraham understands and what Judaism understands is no, there is private property, and there has to be. There has to be mishpat, there has to be law, there has to be private property. Why? So that there could be tzedakah, so that there could be kindness and charity, and the charity only works when you give from what is genuinely yours to somebody else. Because if it's not mine, then it's not charity. So when the Torah, it's very interesting how the Torah doesn't say this explicitly, but if you look in verse 19, even before we introduce Sodom, and the Torah wants to describe Abraham, which is the balance of how the world should be, which is the epitome of kindness. In other words, the philosophy that we're contrasting Sodom with, and you say, what's Abraham? Does Abraham believe in law, or does he believe in charity? Does he believe in private property, or does he believe in charity? Answer is he believes in both because one feeds into the other. And that was the mistake of the people of Sodom, where they got stuck with law. And they got stuck with law, and they said, we only believe in mishpat and law. We don't believe in tzedakah. We don't believe in charity. And Abraham, the Torah presents it, tzedakah and mishpat, law and charity, private property and charity, because if there's no private property, there is no charity. But what this helps us explain is how the people of Sodom initially even get to their philosophy. They start out with trying to respond to the evil of the people of the flood, which had zero respect for private property. So that it
fault the people of Sodom for having reacted the way they did, based upon the fact that the world was destroyed because people weren't respecting private property. And I kind of see that the people have a reason to protect their private property interests and defend it, because look, this other thing caused the flood to happen when people started invading other people's personal property. And no Torah has been given at this point, so no one has any specific guidelines about how to act. And Abraham was just some revolutionary person who's the first person to believe in the one God, and he's, preaching this idea. But for most people, this is, ludicrous.
Okay, so you're making a very good point, and you're actually defending the people of Sodom, which so obviously this commentary resonates. I'll be honest. When I raised this commentary, I wasn't sure people are going to buy into this and try to and buy into Sodom's, to the wicked people of Sodom, and try to justify them. But we did a good job. And we explained where they're coming from. So the takeaway for me is that we have to be very careful that our philosophy, whatever that may be, doesn't lead to cruelty. That's what happened. So Sodom's own philosophy is not so terrible. But if it leads to cruelty, then that's the wake up call. I want to mention one thing. I know Vicky's going to ask and Pablo will ask, but I do want to mention one thing just in response to Jonathan's question, and it ties right in, and then we'll get to the questions. So there is a Mishnah. I have the sun right in my eyes, which is a good thing. Well, not good to see, but I guess good to, maybe I'll keep a little warm here. There's a Mishnah, the ethics of the fathers. So what is the ethics of the fathers? The ethics of the fathers explains the moral teachings of Judaism. You have about 60 tractates of the Mishnah. 59 are focused on the law, and 1 is focused on ethics. So here is a Mishnah that's going to discuss different character traits within people and how they think about property. So all I have to do is find it, and then we'll be in business.
Maybe I'm
Okay, here's the Mishnah. I'm looking at Pirkei Avot, chapter 5, Mishnah 10. Excellent, thank you, Seth. There are 4 character types among men. He who says, what is mine is yours, and what is yours is mine, is an ignoramus. No boundaries. What is mine is yours, what is yours is mine. I just ignoramus. He who says, what is mine, and what is yours. Right? Mine and mine, yours is yours. That's perfectly fine. What's wrong with that? This is a median characteristic, meaning mida beinonis. That's good. That's average. What is mine is mine. What is yours, fine. And some say this is the characteristic of the people of Sodom. He who says what is mine is yours and what is yours is mine is a chassid, pious person. What is mine is yours. What is yours is yours. Everything is for you. That's pious, going beyond the letter of the law. He who says what is yours is mine and what is mine, yours is mine and mine is mine, everything is mine, is a wicked person. So that's the Mishnah. We could talk about this Mishnah for a year, but let's zero in on one clause. Mine is mine and yours is yours. What's that? Private property. Sounds wonderful. What does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says it's the median characteristic. You're not wicked, you're not righteous. It's median. It's good. It's a median middle path. But some people say it's actually the characteristic of the wicked people of Sodom. So 1 second. How is it possible that the same philosophy, one opinion says it's average, it's good for everybody, and the other person says it's so terrible, it's the people of Sodom? Is it average or is it Sodom? You can't argue about 2 extremes. So the answer that people offer is as follows. Of course, what is mine and what is yours is average. There's nothing wrong with saying what is mine is mine, what's yours is yours. That's average. That's not Sodom. The problem is that you have to be careful. If you have this philosophy, do not descend to Sodom. The rabbi who says, the people who say, be careful, this could lead to Sodom, means if you're just doing the mishpat, if you're just doing the law and you're not doing the charity, then you'll actually slip from what is mine and what is yours. You may slip to the people of Sodom. So yes, nobody's arguing. It's the median characteristic. It's 100% fine. But be careful, because if you take this to the extreme, you end up with cruelty. So that's what we're saying here. We're saying that you start out, the people of Sodom, which is a strong belief in private property, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's the median. In fact, it's actually, compare that to the people of the flood, it's commendable. The problem is you have to be careful, because if that leads to no charity, then you descend. So that's for that.
This isn't it. Oh, go ahead, that question.
Okay, go ahead. Vicky, I think was first. Go ahead, Vicky. You're after Bob.
Yeah, I had a question about tzedakah and mishpat. Can we understand it more like Kabbalistically, because it's like a kindness and strength, and that's where the Abraham's tests were. So for him, it wasn't that easy, but he mastered that. And maybe that will give us an answer to how not to go extreme. You have to exercise tzedakah and mishpat in a broader sense. There
is what you're saying also overlaps with the Kabbalah says about Sodom and the world of chaos, which we'll get to. So I'll address that and tie that all in later in a few minutes, God willing. Go ahead, Bob.
I just wanted to reiterate the genius of the Torah here, in that within a few psukim, the Torah contrasts Abraham not by telling you, but by showing you. I mean, once again, Noah spent 125 years building an ark, but never made a conscious effort to convince anybody not to bring on the flood. And the beginning of chapter 19 is almost like Groundhog Day. I mean, the angels come to Lot's tent. You'd say, gosh, didn't we just read this in the beginning of Lech Lecha? But the subtle differences show you why Abraham was so magical and enlightened.
Yeah, it's clear that the Torah is more than preaching. The Torah is painting the picture. And because the pictures are so similar between Abraham and Lot, there's so many similarities. They both make bread, they both make a feast. The similarities actually highlight the differences. And the commentaries keep themselves busy by pointing out those differences. One example is what I mentioned earlier is who participates. In Abraham's tent, it's a simcha, it's a joy for the whole family. A guest comes, everybody's involved. And that's, by the way, how do you teach your children kindness? How do you teach your children kindness? Abraham teaches his children kindness. How does he teach children kindness? He sits down and philosophizes and tells them, takes them to the library and reads philosophy books about kindness. No, when the guest comes, he gives the child an opportunity to participate in the inviting, in creating the food for the guest, right? He tells the lad, run get the calf, not because Abraham is lazy, because he wants everybody involved. That's how you teach kindness, by creating opportunities for your children to perform kindness, as opposed to Lot, he does it all by himself. Seth, and then go ahead, Seth.
Well, people give charity emotionally. It's not always,
That's okay.
I would say 99%.
That's kindness. That's good. That's okay.
So whether there's a law, there's not a law.
Yeah, and so
If somebody sees a problem, I wonder about that.
Okay, so let's go back to the 19th century. You have Karl Marx and others, and you have the theory of socialism. Theory of socialism says, if nobody owns anything and the community owns everything, we can create a better society. That's essentially what they're saying. So now we have 100 years, 150 years of experience. So we know that it's not as simple as it sounds. But I don't want to get into that. What I want to say is, does Judaism accept that notion that if the community owns everything and everybody gets what they need, is that going to be the utopian society? And the argument here is that of course not, because the Torah says, Medrash makes the point in many places, Olam chesed yibaneh, the world was created for kindness. And to have kindness, you have to have people that have and have not. Now, one person has money, the other person does not. One person has health, the other one has not. One person has wisdom, the other person has less wisdom. So the world must be a place, for the purpose of the world to be fulfilled, there has to be a sense of people giving. That's the foundation of the world, kindness. Now, the premise of giving is that I own. If I don't own, I don't give. If I gave you what was yours to begin with, it's not giving. And that's what we're saying here. We have mishpat. You have the philosophy of private property, and that's a premise, the Torah's understanding of what ownership is. Then we get to tzedakah, and tzedakah is only possible when you have mishpat. Now we could sit here literally and talk about this for literally 150 years, because people have been doing this for 150 years, 170 years, talking about what's the best society to create. Now I don't want to do that. I just want to be brief, because we have to continue. So I have a question from Jonathan and a question from Steve, and then we'll continue. And if we have other questions, 10:30, we'll sit and we'll do all the questions. Go ahead.
I just wanted to make a comment about Abraham's soul, and the difference between his soul and Lot's soul is that Abraham had already investigated the universe and discovered that there was a creator, an architect who brought everything into being, and that creator is kind and loving, and he sought in his life to emulate those attributes through being loving and kind.
Right.
So Abraham had actually assimilated Hashem's attributes into his very being. Therefore, he was able to exude kindness and cause his family to exude kindness, because it had become part of his DNA.
Yeah.
It had become him.
Yeah.
And the difference between a Lot and an Abraham is that Lot was on the outside of all this stuff. He was just basically like an auxiliary to Abraham.
Yeah.
It wasn't really Abraham. He was Abraham's someone who had done things because Abraham had told him to do them. But he also, his DNA was, I'm going to graze my cattle in someone else's field.
Right.
I'm not respecting personal property. I'm not going to do what Hashem necessarily wants me to do. I'm going to go over here and graze my cattle where I want to graze it, even if it's somebody else's personal property.
Right.
So his whole essence had not really been converted over to the ways of Hashem.
Yes, let me jump in for a
And
second.
that's why that's why there's a major difference between
Yes.
Abraham's kindness and his kindness,
Yeah.
because he hasn't imbibed anything.
Yeah, let me jump in for a second because we want to talk about why does Abraham do kindness? In other words, we know about two things about Abraham. We know that Abraham believes in the one God, and we know that Abraham is kind. Those are the two things that we know about Abraham. Those are the two most dominant features in his life story. The question is, what is the relationship between the two? So there's an interesting difference between the angels who come to Abraham and the way they come to Lot. And there's all kinds of interpretations of why that
It's the
is.
same angels.
We believe it's this two of, yes, it's the same angels. With Abraham, you have three, and then Lot gets two, because each one has a distinct mission, and once the mission is concluded, they depart. So one of them was there to inform Sarah that she's going to have a child. Once he does that, the angel disappears. He goes back to whatever. He's no longer present in the story. Two of the people continue walking. When you get to Abraham, when it comes to Abraham in Genesis in chapter 18, verse 2, it says, Abraham, he lifted his eyes and saw, and behold, three men were standing over him. He sees three men. When you talk about Lot, when they show up to Lot, the verse says, chapter 19, verse 1, the two angels came to Sodom. Okay? If they were angels or men, how come with Abraham you refer to them as men, and with Lot you refer to them as angels? So there are all kinds of interpretations, and some interpretations is that Lot only invited them because he saw that they're distinct. There are all kinds of interpretations. One interesting, maybe a little slightly poetic interpretation I read the other night was like this: Lot invites them because they look like angels, they look distinct. Abraham invites them because they're people. In other words, to Abraham, every person is an angel. Every person has a spark of God. And that's the connection between the two features of Abraham's story, that he believes in the one God, and he performs kindness. Why does he perform kindness to other people? Because he sees other people as a spark of God, as an angel of God. And therefore, we don't say anything special about these people. The people showed up. People show up. What is people? People are people created in the image of God. So therefore, you perform to them kindness. So in other words, in Abraham, it's integrated. His philosophy about the abstract belief in one God is no longer abstract because he sees that within his interactions with other people. Okay, go ahead, Steve, and then we'll try to pack in some. We'll try to say some things. We'll hold the questions to 10:30 because otherwise. We're not going to get anywhere. Go ahead, Steve Strake. But we can't hear you. We want to hear you, but we can't hear you.
I probably should have waited until 10:30. I apologize for being impatient.
Don't apologize. No.
But the kibbutzim, many of them were successful communities, and maybe it grew out of Jewish culture as opposed to specifically religion, but I don't know, to say that socialism is an antithesis to Judaism. I don't think I think that's too strong.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I don't want to address socialism as a concept and when it works and when it doesn't work. This is way beyond my pay grade. What I do want to say that philosophically speaking, if I cannot have something for me to give, I need to own. And I don't know about I don't know what socialism is. But if you're assuming that you'd create a society where I own nothing and nobody owns anything, assuming you create such a society, I think that tzedakah, charity, chesed, kindness would not exist. Because it's not kindness. It's not kind if I give you something that belongs to you. So if I say from the perspective of Judaism that the olam chesed yibaneh, the purpose of the creation of the world is kindness, then you need to give me opportunity to do kindness, and to do that you need to give me opportunity to own. Now, how much should I own? What should the tax rate be? What should the tax rate be for rich people, for poor people, for corporations? This is what are we asking me? What am I, an economist? I'm not an economist. I don't know. But what I'm saying is that we have to have the idea of mishpat. There has to be law. There has to be a certain element of private property before there could be tzedakah. Now, that's the idea. How to implement it? You have to ask people who do this for a living. Go ahead, 20 seconds. Go ahead, Seth.
I'm sorry. I'll forget. That we believe that Hashem owns everything.
Yeah.
He gives it to
Yes.
us, and it's our responsibility.
Right.
So we don't own anything, and whether we decide to give or not to give isn't even a law. It's in us that we were created to be kind. So I don't understand this whole question of what we're
According to
talking
the
about
Torah,
here.
am I allowed to walk into your house and steal $5? Why not? It all belongs to Hashem. It's not your money
If you
anyway.
steal it, that's on you,
Well, why-
not on me.
so-
I just,
But what's
it's
wrong?
my choice.
Is it your money? Is it your money or is it God's money?
It's God's money.
So then why don't I take it?
Well, then go.
So everything belongs to God, but God introduces the concept of ownership. When God says don't steal, God introduces when God says don't steal, God introduces the concept of ownership. And he says, I give you the right to own something that essentially belongs to God.
No, he said don't steal.
Okay, so 10:30, we're going to discuss this, and
Okay.
and the discussion is going to last for at least 170 years. That's how long the first one lasted. Go ahead, Steve. Yes.
But the third example, I believe you said was, what's mine is yours and what's yours is mine.
Yeah.
Sounds like an advocacy of equal distribution of wealth.
That's a good question. I have to go think about what they're saying. It's Talmud, the Mishnah just says it's, what does he say? What's the language he uses? No. What's mine is yours, but yours, what's mine is yours and what yours is mine. What's mine is yours and what yours is mine.
It's the
That's just,
fool.
it's the fool. It's like, what are you
He
going to
doesn't
do
know
with
any
that?
better. You know, you say like, you can walk into my house and take whatever you want, and I can walk into yours and take whatever I want. It shows no understanding.
Okay, let's deviate back. Let's get back on track, because otherwise, even though this is fascinating, and like I said, a lot of smart people are thinking about this for a very long time, but we're not going to be able to solve everything in one sitting. So we'll just put this out here, put out the ideas, and now you can go home, and for the next week you have the homework, and think about what's the proper balance between tzedakah and mishpat, between ownership and charity, and think about this. Could there be ownership without charity? Could there be charity without ownership? Hopefully this will keep you busy. The main thing is, don't forget to do charity.
You can't have charity without ownership because then you have nothing to give.
Right. Okay. That's what I think. I think that's the balance.
whole point is
That's the
making about
thesis here.
The importance of having private property.
So that you can give.
have tzedakah.
Right.
Right.
Okay. Now that we did the story of Sodom from the philosophical or economic perspective, we're going to go to the story of Sodom from the spiritual, mystical perspective. And the spiritual, mystical perspective says that Sodom, in fact, even though they turn out to be very wicked, but at their core, there's something very powerful and very positive about Sodom. And where do they see this? First of all, the Torah is fascinated by Sodom. We're the fourth portion of the Torah, and we already have 3 stories about Sodom. Okay, we have the story of Lot moving to Sodom. We have the story of the 4 kings capturing Sodom and Abraham coming and releasing Sodom. And finally here, the destruction of Sodom. The Torah is fascinated by Sodom. Then you see the story that we know later in history. Like I mentioned, I alluded to it earlier. King David comes from Sodom. King David comes from Ruth, Moabite convert. As we will see at the end of this story, that Ruth is a descendant of Moab, and Moab is one of the daughters of Sodom, is the mother of Moab. One of the daughters of Lot has this incestuous union with her father and gives birth to Moab. And King David, so in other words, the kingdom of David has an element of Sodom within it. In fact, the Medrash says, there's a verse in Psalms, King David says, Matzati David Avdi, God says, I found David my servant. And the Medrash makes the point that I found, if you find something, means it's unexpected. If you go to the store to buy something, you didn't find it. Found is the idea that the Talmud says, a mitzvah comes behesach hadas. Mitzvah, finding something only happens when you're not paying attention. If you're paying attention, if you expect it, it's not, can't use the term found. So the Medrash says that if the verse says, I found David, says the Medrash, where did I find him? I found him in Sodom. In other words, it's unexpected to find David and the Mashiach. Oh, remember, if David comes from Sodom, then the Messiah comes from Sodom. Then the Mashiach, who's going to bring the world to perfection, is going to come from Sodom. So is Sodom a terribly wicked place? Which it is, no question, it's destroyed. But is there something within Sodom that actually, if used properly, ultimately would ultimately generate King David and ultimately generate the idea of Mashiach perfection in the world. And so just to tie back to the previous conversation before we introduce the next one, this is sort of in between. One element is, what is Mashiach? What is perfection? What is utopia? Not that we believe in utopia, but we believe in Mashiach where all needs are met. When Mashiach comes, we live in Sodom. Then there is a time where there's no poverty and no suffering. Everybody has what they need. Nobody has to give. So essentially what Mashiach comes, essentially what Sodom is they want to make the Messianic era. They want a place where nobody in this town has any needs. And if there's no need, there's no pain. There's no pain, there's no need to give. Okay? What's so terrible about that? It's wonderful. Problem is it's premature. Because we live in a world where there is suffering and there is lacking. So the problem is that these people make themselves an area, they close off a space, and they say, we're going to create Messianic era within this area, keeping all strangers out. And that's why the number one rule is don't let strangers in. Because if you let strangers in, you let poverty in, you let pain in. We don't want pain. We want to create the area where everybody has what they need and everybody can live happily ever after, like in the Messianic era. So now I have nothing against the kibbutzim. Maybe I do, but Steve Strake mentioned the kibbutz. What's the problem with the kibbutz? What a beautiful model. Everybody's together. And certainly in the beginning of Israel, the most prosperous places in Israel were the kibbutzim. It was wonderful. The problem is you have to be part of the group. And right outside the kibbutz, there was terrible poverty. Okay, so that's the problem with Sodom. That's the problem. In other words, it's not a problem. It's that it's premature. Could you close yourself in and create a society of just privileged people who are ignoring people right outside the gates? And that is part of the problem with Sodom. In other words, but again, the concept that we create a place where everybody has what they need because we create a place everyone has what they need. In some sense, that's messianic. So it's not so. In some sense, it's messianic. It's just premature. So that's just to add another thing on the scale for the good of Sodom. But now want to get to the mystical perspective. The mystical perspective. Oh, by the way, one more verse. There's a verse in the prophets that says, "V'shavti et shvut Sodom u'bnotea," I will return and rebuild Sodom. So in other words, God says something about Sodom has to be rebuilt because it's something positive in Sodom. So now we're going to get mystical and Kabbalistic, and we'll talk about the world of order and the world of chaos. Hopefully, we'll do it in a short. I'll try to be brief, 2-3 minutes, and give the Kabbalistic background of the energy of the people of Sodom. So according to the Kabbalistic teachings, when God creates the world, so you have 10 sefirot, you have 10 divine attributes. The way these divine attributes work is that first God emanates 10 attributes of chaos. And chaos is another word for things that are very intense. The first attributes, the first set of 10 attributes, which is the first spiritual world that's created, where all the energies are super intense. Kindness is absolute kindness, judgment is absolute judgment, etc. What happens in that world is that that world crashes. You get the shvira, you got the breaking. Why do you have a breaking? Because the energies of that world cannot coexist. Why can't they coexist? Because the kindness is absolute and wants absolute kindness, and the judgment is absolute, wants absolute judgment. And basically, there's no compromise within the energies because every energy is intense to its fullest degree. So the world crashes, and that energy crashes, meaning there's a shvira, there's a break. And long story short, then God creates another world, and this is called the world of tikkun, the world of order, where to create the world of order, he diminishes the light, it diminishes the intensity of the 10 sefirot, and now they can coexist. And because they can coexist, they don't shatter. Now, what happens with the shattered vessels of the shattered lights and vessels of the world of chaos is that they fall into the world of order, and they fall very low because they shattered. And in short, the job, according to the Kabbalah, the job of the creation of us, the world of order, is to restore the shattered vessels of the world of chaos. In other words, we take the energy of the positive energy of the world of chaos and we incorporate it back into holiness. Now, this we can speak about this for a day, but just to speak about this in just to try to explain it in simple terms and tie it back to Sodom. So in the world of order, in the world of chaos, there is no compromise because kindness, like I said, wants complete kindness and judgment wants complete judgment. What they're also lacking is humility. The Kabbalah explains that the world of chaos is very intense, but there's no humility. Humility means to understand the limitation of self and how my attribute doesn't always work. I sometimes need to accept from somebody else. In other words, to integrate the various energies. To integrate the energies, you have to dim them a little bit, and to dim them, you need a certain degree of humility. What is going to happen at the end of days? At the end of days, you're going to have the energy of chaos in the vessels of order. In other words, we want the energy of chaos, we want that intensity, but we want to use the intensity in a proper way. So there's so many ways of explaining it. The simple way of explaining it is to look at emotions of a child versus emotions of an adult. When a child wants something, the child wants things wants it absolutely. The child wants something, it wants it with a complete intensity. And therefore, you can't compromise. It's very hard for a child to delay gratification because when they want it completely. With an adult, even if you really want something, ultimately, hopefully, a mature adult, that is, in other words, once intelligence is introduced, you could say, well, I want it, but if I can't get it, it's not so terrible because, actually it wasn't that good altogether. There are some aspects of it were not that good. Once you introduce the mind mitigates the emotions, and the mind allows for the various emotions to coexist. But a child doesn't have complex emotions. Either loves you or hates you. With an adult, you could be a mix. Why? Because it's mitigated, the intensity of the emotions are mitigated by the influence of the mind. The mind is like the order, the heart is like the chaos. Now, what's the goal? The goal is, this is hard for me to do, but I have to try to do this. As you get older, to preserve, not to destroy the emotions of the child, in other words, not to lose the intensity of the child's emotion, but to preserve the intensity of the child's emotion, but to apply it in a way to things that the mind approves of. In other words, you want both benefits. You want the intensity of the emotion of the child, but you also want the benefit of the order of the adult. As opposed to if a person has childish emotions, then every emotion is intense and it can't compromise and you can't create complexity. So that is the notion of the Kabbalistic notion of order of chaos. Sodom is the world of chaos. That's why it destroys. But ultimately, the Messianic era, we want the intensity of Sodom. We just want it in a productive way. So therefore, no surprise that King David and the Mashiach ultimately descend from Sodom. So that's the Kabbalistic notion. How does this trickle down? One of the attitudes of the people of Sodom, one of the attitudes of the people of Sodom, which originates from the mystical energy of chaos, is the world of chaos doesn't want to receive from others. If I'm kindness, I'm intensely kind, and I don't want to hear about judgment. If I'm judgmental, I don't want to hear about kindness because I want to be true to my attribute. I don't want to receive from somebody else. That's the mystical energy of the world of chaos. The way that plays out is that in the society of Sodom, people don't want to feel dependent on other people. And they don't like the concept of giving to others, which means I'm dependent on somebody else. They like the concept that every person is alone for themselves. But that is the attitude of the world of chaos. That's the attitude that lacks humility. The attitude of the world of order is that everybody must recognize that there's limitations to their own attribute. Even if your kindness would not produce the proper result if you apply it all the time across the board always. Even Abraham has to introduce judgment into his life, tzedakah or mishpat. Even Abraham eventually is going to agree, even though he's the epitome of kindness, that at some point Sodom has to be destroyed, evil has to be destroyed. But that takes a certain willingness to receive from somebody else. And the world of chaos is not open to that, because the world of chaos, the emotion is so intense and that you want to be loyal to what you are. And if you're a kind person, you want to be kind, you want to be absolutely kind. And if you're into judgment, you want to be absolutely judgmental. You don't want to make compromises. You don't want to say that in different times, different attributes may apply. That would mean you have to accept from others. So the more we get into the energies of chaos and order, and the more we get into the psyche of the people of Sodom, you could see that there are parallels. And just like the world of chaos ultimately leads to destruction, the Sodom also ultimately self-destructs. I shouldn't say ultimately, initially self-destructs. Ultimately, what we want to do is we want to gather the shattered pieces of Sodom, of that intense energy, and build it in a positive way. So that's a big idea. I don't know how well I don't know if I did justice to it, but that's a big idea. And Kabbalistically, this is critical because order follows chaos, because the job of order is to incorporate the energy of chaos in a proper way. So ultimately, we want the energy and intensity of Sodom. We just want to do it in a proper way. So Michael has a question, so we'll take Michael's question and then we'll see from there. Go ahead, Michael.
Hi. So, quick question. So, why were the attributes that could not coexist created to begin with? Is it so that when they break, inevitably we are then rebuilding them? It's like a task for us. Because otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to create something is going to break.
Yes. So yeah, that was all part of the plan. In short, that was all part of the plan. But also think about with children. You first have intense emotion, and then you learn to manage it. And the same thing is in the spiritual energy. The chaotic emotions come out first because in some sense they're more true. Now, I don't want to put out a bad name to the world of chaos. In some sense, they're more true. In other words, the attribute of kindness is completely kind. So in some sense, when kindness will emerge, when it emerges, it will emerge in its full intensity. That's just the natural state. We have it that way because that's the way it is with God. But yes, why does God create a world that ultimately will self-destroy? Because that's the job of the human being. According to the Kabbalah, Tikkun Olam, you may have heard of Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam originates not so much from, it's now used for all forms of social justice, which is wonderful, but that's a borrowed term. The term was created to explain how Tikkun Olam, we correct the world, where we can take the energy of chaos and implement it in an orderly and sustainable fashion. So you have a teenager, and teenagers are either very selfish, but teenagers are also very idealistic. And idealism, how do you deal with idealism? So in some sense, if someone is completely idealistic, what's going to happen at the end? If they're completely to the extreme, they're going to self-destroy because they don't care about themselves. They don't even there's all kinds of problems with absolute idealism. And it could lead to chaos. What's our job? To experience it, but then to channel it. So yes, the short answer to your question is, yeah, that was all part of the plan. Yes. Go ahead, John.
Thank you.
To me, it's an interesting parallel is that the idea that people of Sodom could not tolerate.
Rabbi?
Hang on, Beth, a second. Go ahead.
Sure.
So
Beth,
if-
1 second, please. Beth, 1 second, because John is asking a question. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. My daughter just rang the doorbell and I didn't know why, so I ran.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
just making a comment about how my understanding is that the people of Sodom couldn't tolerate the poor people. And we have in this world lots of people who can't tolerate difference. Those are people who
Yes.
are prejudiced. Those are people who are racist. Those
Yeah.
are people who believe that, only their kind should exist and we have to isolate other people who aren't like us.
Yes.
And I just wanted to express that idea that to me, what Sodom represents is that racist, prejudicial society that doesn't tolerate the poor person. And part of the Messianic dream is to go in and say, no, that there is otherness, that we have to compromise, we have to harmonize with all different kinds of things in creation. And that if we just exist on that level of only kindness, only good judgment, like those vessels that exploded because they couldn't harmonize with each other, that in life we have to learn to harmonize with
Yes.
difference and
Yeah.
things that aren't like us, and that poor people exist with rich people, and that handicapped people exist with people who are not handicapped.
Yeah,
In fact,
very
we
good.
exist with
Very
them.
good. That's good. We have to go to the next person, but very good. So you're saying that all concepts of, according to the Kabbalah, all concepts of coexistence really means acknowledging that not only there's room for other people, but we receive something from people who are different than us. No, there's nobody. Remember, I mentioned earlier that there has to be a giver and a recipient, and the giver by definition has to have, and the recipient is the have-not. So there's haves and have-nots. But the bottom line is we have to recognize that everybody has something and is lacking something. There's nobody that has everything. Everybody has something, and in some area, there's always an area where I lack, and I need you to give to me. Either in any area, it could be an idea, it could be an emotion, it could be financial, it could be in any area it may be. But world of order recognizes that there is no perfection without integration. Okay, go ahead, Beth. We can't hear you, but I don't know if you want to ask, but. Okay, there's one very strange story that people, okay, there's so many strange stories.
Rabbi, I was going to raise a similar point, which is if having a society where it therefore enables charity, it also opens the door for the opposite, for greed, for coveting other people's property. So if you could just speak to that.
Yeah, there's no question. That's why you have the idea of tzedakah or mishpat. You need balance. So what's the proper way, right? So if you want to think about it, there's two extremes. One extreme is the generation of Sodom, the generation of the flood, which say there's no private property. We don't like private property because it creates greed. I can give you an hour's lecture of why private property is not good. It leads to moral deficiency. Okay, so that's one extreme. Then you have the other extreme, is the people of Sodom who say that private property is absolute. And what is the Torah saying, or at least what does Abraham represent? It's tzedakah mishpat. It's the balance, and life is about, the world of order is about finding the balance. If anybody tells you absolutes in the world of order, you have to be very skeptical of absolutes in the world of order. The world of order, a lot of it is integration. In some areas, this is right. In some areas, the other thing is right. Private property, yes, you have to have private property. You also have to do charity. But again, have to do charity means it's yours to give. If it's not yours, you're not giving. So the answer is, we need, in the world of order, we need middle ground. And therefore, Abraham himself, and that's what Vicky alluded to earlier, Abraham himself begins his life journey as a completely kind person with the inability to do any judgment or any discipline. And especially in this parsha, Abraham learns to incorporate discipline, which is painful for him. We have this story where he has to agree with the destruction of Sodom. You have next story where he has to ultimately send away his son Isaac, and then the binding of and his wife Hagar. So this is not an easy process for somebody who is the epitome of kindness. But in this world, you can't just be kind. It just doesn't work. It's not. You have to integrate other energies as well. And someone who's completely disciplined is also not going to get you where you need to be. But that's Isaac, and Isaac creates other unintended consequences, which is Esav. In other words, Isaac has to learn. Ultimately, we need the integration of kindness, of giving, and discipline, and which is judgment. And in this world, we need the integration, and that's the short answer. But I'm sure if you brought somebody here from the world of chaos, they would give you a whole lecture how the world of order is a distraction, and the world of chaos is intense, and the world of chaos is true because you're being true to yourself, and it's not hypocritical, et cetera, et cetera. But the bottom line is, we believe that ultimately we're going to rectify the world of chaos. Ultimately, we're going to get that intensity, but we're going to apply that intensity in a constructive manner. And that's the rebuilding of Sodom. Yeah, a lot more to say. There's a lot more to say, but I think it will be it for today. If anyone has any comments or questions or elaborations, please, we finally hit 10:30. Everybody can share what they want to share. Next week, we want to continue, and we get to it's an interesting story. I mean, how do you relate to the story of Lot and his two daughters? Multiple ways to look at it. And the big question is, what is the Torah trying to allude to and tell us? And there's a lot more to unpack in this chapter 19. Chapter 19 is fascinating. It's, Bob said earlier that the Torah doesn't give, at least in Genesis, doesn't give you speeches. It just tells you the narrative. And the challenge with that narrative is, the challenge of that style is that we don't always know which actions are, what the Torah thinks about certain actions. Are they moral? Are they immoral? And case in point is going to be Lot and his two daughters. But for that, we have to come back next week in good health. And everybody have a wonderful day and a wonderful week, and stay warm, of course.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Yes, Rabbi, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yashiko.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Wonderful day.
You too.
Rabbi, thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Oh, good, Rabbi. Thank you.